And so tonight we're going to hear about weed management from Bryan Brown, who is from New York State IPM, a program that's part of Cornell Cooperative Extension. He's a weed specialist there, and we're glad to have him here. It's an area that we don't always have robust education. So thanks to Bryan for coming and giving this workshop today. So he's gonna share his slides here and we'll get started.
So yeah, thanks for the intro, and I'm happy to be here. Once again, my name's Bryan Brown. I'm all the way over in New York. I'm near Ithaca, near Cornell. Part of Cornell, it's a program called New York State Integrated Pest Management. And all right, so today I'm going to be talking about vegetables, and I'm assuming most of you are vegetable growers, farmers, or gardeners. But I also deal with field crops and fruit and other commodities. But I'm trying to limit today's talk to just vegetables. And I have a 25-75% split between research and extension. So I'll be talking about some research and some extension projects I've been working on as well. And so today I'm going to be talking about how we can take principles of IPM, which, if most people hear IPM, they probably think of thresholds of when to spray for a certain pest. If you don't have enough pests to warrant the cost of the spray, then you don't spray. Only spray if there's enough pests to that you're over your damage threshold. But IPM is a lot more than that, and a lot of the principles of IPM are captured in this IPM pyramid, and I'll be coming back to this, and I've kind of structured my presentation today based on this pyramid. So the chemical controls, herbicides in this case with weeds, are very effective, and so they're at the top. But they're also they can potentially damage or injure your crop. There's environmental considerations with herbicides, and so for IPM, we like to try to prioritize these practices and weed control tactics that are below chemicals. So kind of the baseline practices to try to control as many weeds as we can through just thinking about a rotation and preventing weeds from setting seed and things like that, so that our higher level controls, our more expensive controls, can be as effective as possible. So I'm going to start at the bottom and work my way to the top. So starting with prevention, I'm going to talk about why it is important to prevent weeds from setting seed. I think most of us know that's a bad thing, but unfortunately, a lot of times it's just hard to get out there and prevent them from doing that. You have to be very effective in your weed control, you have to stay on it, and it can be time-consuming, labor-consuming, and costly. But I think it's worthwhile, because if you look at this this picture of an onion field, this is an experiment I did back at University of Maine, and a few plots in these fields were intentionally allowed to for the weeds to go to seed, as you see here, mostly Lambsquarters and some others. Coming back the next year, boom, there's that plot, and you can see all of those weed seeds just went right into the soil, and that corn, which we followed up the onions with, in those plots where the weeds went to seed, really had to compete with the weeds and lost out on yield big time. And I think the weed emergence in those plots was about 10 times that of the surrounding plots. So it just shows weeds can produce so many seeds, thousands, some of them approaching 1 million seeds per plant if you let it thrive without competition. So it's really important to try to prevent them from setting seed. And the old saying, one year seeding is 7 years of weeding, really does have some truth to it. But it's not quite that simple. This is a more accurate representation of how long weed seeds live in the soil. And the longevity of most weed seeds follows something called a half-life. So how long does it take for half of those seeds to become inviable in the soil? Oh. And for most of our, well, maybe not most, but for a lot of our problem weed species, like here, crabgrass, red root pigweed, common lambsquarters, horseweed, they have a half-life of around a year. So that means if you just if you're able to prevent any new seeds from entering your soil, then half of those seeds that are in your soil from previous year's seed rain will die of natural causes from weathering and microbial action. So we have that on our side. This is, I think, really good news. And of course, some people will say, well, look at the tail out here. There's a few seeds that live for 100 years maybe. But yes, but I think that overall this is good news for growers in that if you can just do a really good job for a few years, and I've seen growers do this for 3 or 4 years and have a completely different weed situation after that. Also, back at the University of Maine, I was part of some studies that looked at the number of weed seeds in growers' soil, and so I took samples of soil from different farms and then grew those soil samples out in the greenhouse, and then counted the weeds that emerged, and there was a lot of variability based on the different farms. Some of these seed banks were full of weed seeds, as on the left here, thousands of weeds per square foot of soil, whereas others, like on the right, were pretty empty of weed seeds. And so those farmers would have a lot easier time of farming now, but I think it would have taken a few years of those farmers on the right trying to really actively prevent weeds from setting seed. Okay. And do stop and ask questions if you have any. I have a lot of slides to get through, but if we don't get through them, then that's fine.
Yeah, I'll just make one more quick announcement that if you called in by phone, you may need to enter an audio pin 79182 and then *6 to unmute. But otherwise, most of you should be able to mute and unmute yourself on the computer. So if you do have any questions, feel free to chime in at any point, and always use the questions box. So are there any questions now? I think we can keep going for now, and folks can use the questions box.
All right. So there's a few options if you do have a disaster year and your early season weed control just didn't cut it. Weeds have overtaken your crop. I mean, if it's really bad, I would consider just tilling in that area, and just that's the easiest, quickest way to do it: mow and then till. Some growers would try to maybe mow at the height just above the crop level to take off those flowering and seed heads before the seed fully matures. And a newer option is this that's on the slide here, the weed zapper, which there are now a few of in New York, and I'm not sure about Massachusetts, but they're available for hire. And this is a use of high voltage electricity to actually shock weeds that are above the level of the crop, and that electricity runs down into the root, killing most of the plant. But if it's too late and the weeds have already set seed, those seeds are starting to rain down into your soil, you do still have some options. You could think about doing different types of tillage. Moldboard plows are good at inverting the soil. And so you can see here on the left that the moldboard plows typically put that seed 4 to 6 inches deep, where most of our small weed seeds are not going to germinate and emerge from. They just don't have the energy. And so they'll stay down there until you moldboard again and pull them up. Unfortunately, weed seed decay is not as rapid at that depth. So the half-lives that I was talking about earlier are longer than I showed than at the soil surface. Whereas chisel plowing kind of just works in those seeds a little bit, 2 to 4 inches, where they may be able to germinate. And then no-till, of course, leaves them right on the soil surface, where rains and frosts will kind of work them in over time. But while they're right on the surface, they are subject to being eaten by beetles, by mice, by birds. There are a lot of animals that eat weed seeds. And some work has shown that up to 50% of them can be eaten in a given year. So that can be a big help. And then if you go with a no-till, or just leave those weed seeds right on the soil surface, then the next year they are going to be more likely to germinate, getting all that heat. And most weed seeds like to germinate within the top inch or half inch of the soil. So something that I would consider is, if I had a bad year last year, is in the spring, just encourage as much weed seed germination as possible. Some growers will lightly till, maybe cultipack, even irrigate, to try to encourage germination and then control all those weeds before you plant your crop. And so that's kind of the principle behind the stale seed bed idea. So remove as many seeds as you can before planting. Okay, back to IPM Pyramid. So that's prevention. Any questions on prevention, feel free to shout them out. Otherwise, I'll move on to cultural practices. And for cultural practices, I'm really thinking about crop rotation and cover cropping, and how those interact with the life cycle of weeds. Typically, the problem weeds for a given field fit nicely within the typical crop rotation, in that a farmer typically selects for weeds that can complete their life cycles before harvest and before tillage or burn down of the crop or cover crop. So thinking about ways to shift the timing of planting and tillage and harvest for a given field is a good idea. And this is why. Weeds have very different periods for when they typically emerge, germinate and emerge from the ground. And this is some work from, I believe it was Iowa, but somewhat similar temperature and climate conditions as the Northeast, and that it's it's still cold. But down here, the months are adjusted based on growing degree days. You see that April is really short, May is pretty short, and then June, July is the longest. So growing degree days, this is the number of degrees above 50 degrees for a given day. So if your average temperature, you average that. So growing degree days is something that you can keep track of on your own, or you can check out the NEWA website, NEWA, Network for Environment and Weather Applications, which has a number of weather stations throughout the Northeast. And chances are there's one pretty close to you where you can check out your growing degree days and see how this matches up for your problem weeds. Cornell is also creating an emergence model for several weed species that should be up and running within the next couple years. So if you see any of your problem weed species on here, you could say, hey, okay, say ragweed up at the top, second one down, that has a very short spike of emergence very early in the season, April, early May. So, if ragweed, for example, is your primary problem weed, then it looks like maybe you could move tillage, earlier, delay planting so that you can control this weed and till and have it start with a clean slate after ragweed has finished emerging. Whereas some of the others, ones that we're dealing with in New York, like common Waterhemp down at the bottom, have a long emergence period. So you're going to have to think about controlling, having good control throughout the season, either through repeated tillage, mulching, or repeated herbicide or residual herbicide usage. So here's a bit of an example of what I was just talking about, in that weeds typically, summer annual weeds typically set seed in mid-August. That is when they start setting viable seed. So if you can design a crop rotation to finish up before mid-August, then you are likely preventing all of those weeds from producing seed, which is great. Or you could think about delaying, doing the stale seed bed technique, and on the bottom here, repeated harrowing or burn down herbicides, and then do a late crop. But again, you're going to need some late season or residual weed control to prevent seed production. I also include mulch under cultural controls, both plastic mulch, or this is, I believe, a hay bale that's being unrolled here. And there's definitely an art to plastic mulch, and I'll say a little bit about that more later on. But for hay or straw, you really need about 9 tons per acre is kind of the standard for effective season-long weed suppression. Plastic mulch is people love it and they hate it. It has a lot of great horticultural benefits, from warming the soil and such, saving labor for hard to control crops. But in cases like this, it also can require more labor in some cases for hand weeding those holes and the edges, the interface between the plastic and the tire tracks, the wheel tracks, can be difficult to control. There are some mechanical tools. There's some basically finger weeders on their sides that go through. There's some brushes of different stiffnesses that can control that interface. some broad shielded applications of herbicides as well. But yeah, so a big thing that I see is that a lot of growers, unfortunately, their planting hole is giant, and that kind of defeats the purpose. I know it's hard to get some of those transplants in there, but see what you can do to really minimize the size of that planting hole. And in some cases, with crops like onions or crops where the stem increases over time, the crop will stretch that planting hole, so there's really no airspace between the plastic and the crop, and so it can really effectively smother out weeds. Some other mulching examples, it can be expensive and labor costly for labor to bring in hay or straw, so some growers will grow the mulch in place, so to speak, with crops like buckwheat shown here, which is seeded in the spring and then mowed down at flowering to basically grow your own mulch. Or in the case of rye, this was planted in the fall. After a crop of tomatoes was grown on this mulch, the black plastic mulch, which was left in the ground. And so the grower got 2 seasons out of this plastic mulch, and then mowed down that rye at flowering to provide a nice straw mulch over the paths.
I have a
And
question.
of course, yeah.
Then how do they get the plastic out of there after 2 years? Is it like difficult to? I feel like sometimes after one season, it's like coming apart.
It can break up, and yeah. I haven't followed up with this grower to know if he has one of those mechanical kind of mulch removal tools, or if it's just by hand. But that's a good question. Yeah, I would imagine that it would potentially be a little bit more difficult, especially if there's hay or other residue on top of it.
Or maybe it'd be easier. I don't know. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so for some of the heavier duty mulches or tarps, I created a little table to just kind of compare and contrast. So starting on the left, some of you may have heard or tried solarization. So this is clear plastic, and this is done usually in the summer months when it's hot to superheat the soil. And the key with solarization is burying the edges, which either takes time or takes a special plastic layer, as shown there, to seal all that heat in. And it's done after a rain or irrigation because you need a wet heat rather than a dry heat. But it can actually increase the soil up to 120. And right at Cornell, I had a soil temperature probe at about 1 or 2 inches deep, and we got 120 degrees just in the second day, one sunny day. So that can actually kill weed seeds. Some of them, not all of them, but you can reduce your weed seed bank, at least the seeds that are in the top inch or two, using solarization. And then it'd have to be removed before planting. Landscape fabric is one that some growers will burn holes in and plant right into, and use it repeatedly, maybe 5 years or so, or for walkways. And then tarping with silage tarps. This is black plastic, a thick, I think like 6 mil black silage tarp. And this is more flexible than solarization because it doesn't require that hot, sunny weather. You can leave it on in the fall, over the winter, and it's basically like pressing pause on if you till and you've got everything clean and ready to go. You can make your beds the year before, put the tarp on, and then whenever you're ready to go in the spring, remove those and plant immediately. They tend to make the soil very friable as well, So they've got a number of benefits, and they do, I think, reduce the weed seed bank to some extent, not to the same extent as solarization though. And some growers have used them to terminate cover crops as well. All right, so next rung up the ladder, physical, mechanical controls, and I'm primarily going to talk about cultivation. And of course, cultivation shown here can be really effective between crop rows. You can drag just about any piece of metal between the crop rows and kill weeds. But down on the bottom, it's a lot harder to kill weeds actually in that crop row with cultivation. So this is an area where I've done a fair amount of work. And I've been working primarily with this tool on the left, made by Hawk, but there's a few designs with a rear steering system. So the tractor driver doesn't have to be dead on. There's some flexibility because you've got someone in the back that can move the cultivator, I think 6 inches left or right of center to keep the cultivator right centered on the crop, which is important for using some of these in-row tools. Another simple kind of guidance system is just a belly-mounted cultivator. So you turn left, the cultivator actually goes left, and then on the expensive, the far end is camera guidance and GPS guidance. But these are really, really helpful for improving your in-row efficacy of controlling weeds. You can get a lot closer to the row, and you can be more aggressive. And when we're controlling weeds mechanically in general, you're doing it in one of three ways. You're either cutting the weed at the base, you're pulling out the roots and letting it dry out in the sun, or you're burying it so that it cannot see the sun's rays and photosynthesize. And one thing that I've always liked to show growers is some work that I've been doing the past few years, looking at what I call stacking. So using not just one in-row weed control implement, but stacking on 2 or even 3, like here. So this is a setup with sweeps at the front on the left, followed by finger weeders, followed by some small discs. And this is a slow motion video, by the way, in Snap Beans. And in this video, so this is that cultivator that I'm using that was in the previous picture, but I really didn't have to steer it at all because this was GPS planted, and the tractor pulling the cultivator in this case was on that same GPS line. So it really helped out. And the other thing is that, so we've got sweeps, which are undercutting, and then we've got finger weeders, which are basically uprooting weeds. And then we've got the disc killer, which is burying. So we've got those 3 kind of mechanisms for mechanically killing weeds all in one setup. And this setup I found to regularly control 90% of the in-row weeds, as long as you've done a good job getting the crop up out of the ground ahead of the weeds.
Brian, I have a question.
Yeah.
This seems really cool, but also maybe a lot of farmers in Massachusetts anyway don't seem to be using GPS planting and those kinds of things. I wonder, can you get close to that if you don't have those precision planters? And then also, how expensive would a setup like this cost with that sort of behind the implement steering and this multiple tools?
Yeah, so we bought a 2-row unit, and I think it was with all the sweeps and the fingers and the finger and the discs, I think it was around 10 grand. And so you don't need the GPS because you have that rear side shift adjustment in the back, that extra person on the back. But it does just really reduce your crop damage and how aggressive you can be. I did some similar work back at UMaine with without the GPS, and crop damage was maybe 10 to 15%. Efficacy was around 90, so similar to this trial, but crop damage was 10 to 15% mortality for each pass, whereas in this trial it was 0 to 5%. So
okay, thanks.
it's something to factor in. Yep.
If there are any other questions, feel free to drop them in the questions box anytime. Thanks.
All right. And I think more important than the tool setup and the tool, what kind of implement you're using, is the timing for in-row cultivation. Even if you're just using sweeps and you're just trying to throw some soil in that in-row zone, the timing, you really have to be targeting those in-row weeds at the cotyledon stage. So less than 1 inch tall is when they're most susceptible to in-row cultivation. Any later than that, and your effectiveness really drops quickly, unfortunately. And this is just some recent work that I've done looking at, okay, over all of these trials that I've done, and some from Michigan, how much of the selectivity, which is, I guess, how good the tool is at pulling out the weeds while leaving the crop, how much is that related to the difference in height between the weed and the crop? And it was actually the main determinant, was this ratio of the height of the crop to the height of the weed. So in this case, one of the trials, the most effective one over here on the far right, a ratio of around 7. So the crop was, say, 7 inches tall, and the weed was, around 1 inch tall. So that's ideal situation when you can be really effective. And it's about how do you get there. And I think still seedbed is important to give you that delay, give you that head start with the crop. And I think residual herbicides are a good option beforehand. And then there's always, hand weeding once early on to just remove those in-row weeds, get the crop up, and then after that, allow the in-row cultivation to take over. But yeah, you see the different colors here, the different shapes are the number of in-row implements. And I found that didn't really matter in terms of selectivity. So, so this is crop mortality at 80% efficacy, which is kind of my proxy for selectivity. And this was done through modeling. So even if the cultivator only killed 20% of the weeds, I modeled it up to what that would look like at 80% efficacy by increasing the crop mortality to the same extent. And it turned out that the number, that if you're stacking tools, that didn't have an effect on the selectivity. It wasn't more effective, and it wasn't less selective. So, all right.
There was a
question
about the finger weeders.
Yeah.
Do those work well in situations where you have crops on drip, or does the drip tape get tangled up in there?
I would potentially use drip if it was buried. You know, if you're burying the drip, you know, right next to the crop row, I think it's what, 2 inches deep. Then I'd go for it. Otherwise, no.
Not drip irrigated stuff, but like brassicas, mate. What other crops would you recommend these for?
Oh, I mean anything, as long as it's you know, as long as it's at least maybe 5 inches tall, and you know, but not more than however tall the, you know, the cultivator needs to be to get through, maybe 1.5 feet. Anything in that zone that hasn't you know, branched out too much. And the more the crop branches out, you can just adjust the finger weeders to, instead of, you know, being overlapped, you can just move them out a little bit, or just drive slower. You know, the speed is a really easy way that growers can use to control the aggressiveness. So yeah, driving slow is less aggressive than driving fast, obviously.
Okay. I'd be curious to know also like how many growers. There's a small group of commercial growers on the call here, so just curious if you guys feel like using the question box to maybe just say I've used finger weeders and they work great, or you know, those kind of comments might be interesting for discussion also. Okay.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Brian. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. So for weed control, for vegetables, we're just not there yet for biological control, that, you know, the next rung up here. In other crops, we have some options with you know, potentially different animals, or you know, or insects that can predate upon weeds. But unfortunately, those tend to be generalist and would likely predate on the crops as well for vegetables. So I'm going to skip that for now and go up to chemical controls to finish up here. So just to set the scene, you know, unfortunately, we are in a bit of a crisis with herbicide resistance, and it's really on the rise. And states in the Northeast don't necessarily have that many herbicide resistant weeds listed on the registry online, but they are there. And New York only has 4 listed, but there's, you know, at least twice that, and they're becoming more and more common. One that you may be seeing and may have already in Massachusetts is herbicide-resistant horseweed, or mare's tail, which is resistant to glyphosate and ALS inhibitors, which I'll talk about later. But this develops when, unfortunately, you know, growers will rely on a certain herbicide and use it year after year, and if that is the only selection pressure that those weeds are facing, and there's one that happens to have a mutation that survives it and produces seeds and spreads, and that's how the problem can proliferate. So one of the most basic things that is being touted as really important for growers to do is to try to diversify the herbicide families. And a good way to simplify that for yourselves is to look up herbicide modes of action. And there's a number of different tables. Probably just the first website that comes up will have one of these charts, and it really breaks it down nicely. So you can see, okay, for example, okay, 2,4-D, dicamba, stinger, these are all in the same group. So you know, I need to be diversifying to try to limit the amount of resistance that's building up. I need to be using a more diverse array of herbicides. So, you know, for example, if if you're just looking at the name, you might think, okay, 2,4-D and dicamba, they're different products, but really they're acting very similarly inside the weed, and so they're not doing much different in terms of trying to prevent resistance from building up. And this is a picture I took of one of our herbicide-resistant weeds in New York called Waterhemp. It's in the pigweed family. Looks a lot like pigweed, and this was hit with glyphosate and dicamba, and it's resistant to glyphosate. I don't think it's resistant to dicamba yet in New York, but it was just too tall. You have to get this weed when it's less than 4 inches tall. And the same is true with horseweed. So they say if it's larger than a soda can, it is really hard to kill with just chemicals. So you've got to be vigilant. You've got to get it before it gets to that size, and that's a good practice to do in general. You can see here these got healthy branches growing out of this injury. And this is, unfortunately, herbicide-resistant weeds make growers revert to some drastic measures here, and we are just getting the weed whacker out to try to prevent this water hemp from producing seeds. And it's flowering right here, and we're just trying to get it beforehand.
I have to say this is my weed management strategy of, well, last resort, but also I seem to end up doing a fair bit of it every year.
Really? Yeah. And yeah, so you have growers that, they're hand pulling weeds out of soybean and cornfields because they don't want these things to go to seed, because that, if it does, then it basically means that Roundup or whatever their cheapest and most effective options are not going to cut it. So it's going to really increase their costs in the future. So that's why they're going to these drastic measures to control these weeds. And here's water hemp, very similar to pigweed or your more common red root pigweeds and smooth pigweeds. Has a little bit narrower leaf, and it's hairless. So that's the big thing to look for. No hairs on the stem, unlike most of our other pigweeds. So if you see that, let someone know. Get help. And then here's horseweed. Probably a lot of you have horseweed already, but perhaps not the herbicide-resistant biotype. Horseweed looks very similar to goldenrod. I get calls on distinguishing between them. And the easiest way for me is that the leaves of horseweed are widest a little bit closer to the tip of the leaf, whereas goldenrod leaves are widest closer to the base of each leaf. Hope everyone sees that. Okay. But horseweed, unlike most of our problem weeds where the seed just drops straight to the ground, and that's where it stays unless you till it, horseweed has windblown seed, and that seed can travel for miles. So unfortunately, we have it in New York, and the wind is blowing to mass. So be on the lookout for that. And once again, it's resistant to glyphosate and AOS inhibitors, which are group 2 if you're looking at mode of action charts. So what are some of the options for the common herbicides for vegetables? I've listed a few here, and I've also listed their Weed Science Society of America group. So this is the mode of action that I talked about earlier from that chart. And you can see that there's a few group 3s, there's quite a few group 15s, there's some group 14s. So you want to make sure that over the course of your crop rotation that you're using as many different groups as you can and not over relying, say, on dual or goal, but trying to diversify and thereby limit the development of resistance. Okay, and I've also listed here some of the spectrum of control for these products, and a lot of the products available in vegetables are basically grassweed herbicides, like the group 3s and the group 15s. They're basically grassweed products that work a little bit on some small seeded broadleaf weeds like pigweed or lambsquarters. So there's not as many that control those larger seeded broadleaves, like Velvetleaf has a very large seed, mustards, some of the smart weeds. They're going to probably grow through these most of these products. And then, of course, you got to think about the timing, whether it's a residual product applied before planting or right after planting, whether it's post. Can you use it over the top of the crop? That's going to vary by crop, even varies by state with labeling. So it's very important that you read the label and you're completely on top of what is the labeled use for each product. And another thing to be aware of is their interaction with plastic mulch. Some products you can use in conjunction with plastic mulch, some you can't. So just another thing to be very aware of by reading the labels. Quickly, just want to talk about this interesting study that started with some residual herbicides and then followed that up with cultivation. And they cultivated with a rolling cultivator, a Lilliston. And this is a similar one. This is a photo I had in strawberries, even though the trials were in broccoli. Rolling cultivators are, I think, the best at controlling weeds in residue. They don't get gummed up with residue, and they've got a crossbar on the back of between each gang of tines here that throws out any extra residue. And so in this trial, they sprayed so Devronol, Dual, and Goal, the products there in order, and either followed it up with cultivation or not. And as you expect, you can just see that where they followed up with cultivation, the control was higher. And I just want to note that when you're using cultivation in conjunction with residual products, it's just tough to determine when to cultivate based on how many weeds are emerging, based on the weather. You obviously don't want to come through and cultivate bare ground, and you're just going to break up that barrier that the residual products are offering. But then on the other hand, you don't want to wait too long so that the weeds are too big for cultivation to control, and you have to resort to hand weeding. So just another very important dilemma that farmers have to face. So if there's not any more questions, I guess I just have a few of the common species here. Lambsquarters, probably most of you have. Very prolific weed, can produce, I think, around 500,000 seeds if it's not competing with anything. Small seeded crop and one of the first to emerge, but does have a bit of an extended emergence. Ragweed is one of the first to emerge, one of the first that you see. Velvetleaf with that large seed. Velvetleaf, we've had some difficulties with Velvetleaf in New York. A number of things make it hard to control with chemicals. It's got a hairy leaf so that the the chemical doesn't stick to the leaf as well. You may need an adjuvant, and the leaves are drooping, so it can just run right off. And it's got that large seed, so it can emerge from deep in the soil, well, relatively deep for weeds, a few inches, potentially even growing through and having enough energy to grow through a residual herbicide layer. Galinsoga is very common on vegetable farms. I will say that the Achilles heel of Galinsoga is that it has a very short half-life in the soil, and it has almost no dormancy. So you can have several generations of Galinsoga emerging. Like this one can produce seed. That seed can go in the ground midsummer and then come up. Whereas most seeds have to go through an overwintering period. So if you're able to just have one really solid year of good control Galinsoga, because most of it dies within 1 year in the soil, the seeds, that should take care of most of it. So it can be a big problem on certain farms, but it doesn't last if you can do a good job.
Yeah, that's actually really nice to hear, because I feel like we do focus on how long the seeds can last in the soil. So to understand that actually they're pretty short-lived for the most part.
Yeah.
It's reassuring.
Yeah.
I'm gonna take a second and unmute everybody again.
Yep.
It seems like my effort to keep people unmuted has not been very successful. So just if there is any question, and for those of you who are calling in on the phone again, *6, I think that's best.
I'll just quickly mention, Sue, that
good idea.
there's some great apps out there that I've been really impressed with, especially Picture This. As long as you take a good picture with it, close up, focused in on the plant, they're very accurate. And so that's been a big help for me, someone that's pretty good at identifying plants. And other apps are helping with scouting, mapping and such. And I just want to show the website here if you're looking for any further info. Yeah, so let's hear some questions.
Hello, Brian. This is Terry in New Jersey.
Oh, hey, Terry.
Just wanted to comment on Galinsoga. You really point out that it's one of the most troublesome weeds that we have to face further down in the south. Not many of the herbicides that we're using will provide good control of Galinsoga. On really that stress the need for really good cultural management practices for controlling it, because herbicides that we have so far are really poor at controlling it. So I appreciate that you really pointed out that specifically.
Oh, great. So do you think it's resistant to herbicides, or is it just very robust and hard to kill?
No, my experience is that it's really robust. I mean,
okay.
We are trying some new herbicides, something like sulfentrazone, which is not widely labeled for on veggies. I have a trial on basil, and sulfentrazone is really good at controlling Lambsquarters. It's good at controlling purslane, but the only weed that is still emerging is Galinsoga. On this one is really, if you're coming in New Jersey, that's the #1 weed species with yellow nutsedge, basically in veggies. And it's more robust to any herbicide than any other weed species and any other broadleaf weed species that I know.
Wow. Huh. Okay. Yeah, we don't have it. I mean, it's in New York and it's on vegetable farms, but we don't have it in as great quantities as Lambsquarters or pigweeds.
I really think that if people start to have it on the farm, they need to identify it as quickly as possible and don't let them go to seed. Because you're completely right. I had experimentation for the modeling that we are going through the northeast, and definitely the seed that are dropped in July or August will germinate the very same year.
Yeah.
And cannot let this one go to seed. It's really a nightmare. But no, just great job tonight, Bryan.
Oh, thank you, Terry. Good to hear your voice.
There was a request to go back to the slide with the apps.
Yes.
Can you look at
So
those?
these are some of the scouting apps, and I haven't looked into these so much, but they can help with the mapping and the note taking, so you don't have everything on paper notebooks. So Scout Pro, eCrop Scout, Connected Farm, and then with the Weed ID, I'll just leave this up. Any other questions?
Yeah, we are about out of time. We did have some comments from people that are using the finger weeders and some of the other tools that you mentioned. So I can try to share some of that.
Oh, and we actually have some questions for the growers too, right?
Yeah, we do. So
Yeah.
I think what people pointed out is that there's a lot of different tools, and the timing is important with all of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, with that, thank you again, Bryan, for coming and offering this talk. It was really informative for me, I know. So, and thanks for everyone for participating.